When we talk about true crime, we often ask why it happened. But rarely do we ask a more difficult question. What happens to the people left behind? Tonight, we are not looking at the suspect. We're looking at the silence that families carry for the rest of their lives. There is a strange kind of peace that exists right before life changes forever. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It does not arrive with warning signs or flashing lights. It is simply ordinary life continuing as it always has, so normal that no one questions it. For Laci's family, those final days before her disappearance were filled with routines so familiar they felt permanent. Phone calls, errands, small jokes, casual conversations about upcoming plans. Nothing seemed fragile. Nothing seemed temporary. And that is what makes the memory of those days so haunting. Tragedy rarely introduces itself politely. It arrives disguised as another ordinary morning. In many families, especially close ones, there is an invisible rhythm that keeps everyone connected. It is not written down, not formally scheduled, yet everyone feels it. A mother expects a call at a certain hour. A sister anticipates a message or shared laugh. These habits are so consistent they become emotional anchors. They provide reassurance that relationships are stable and life is unfolding as expected. When those rhythms suddenly stop, the silence they leave behind is not just noticeable, it is disorienting. It feels as if gravity itself has shifted, and the mind struggles to understand why. Before anything was wrong, there were simple moments. Conversations that seemed insignificant at the time. Plans discussed casually, with the assumption there would always be more time later. Human beings rarely recognize the value of ordinary interactions while they are happening. We assume continuity. We assume tomorrow will resemble today. This assumption is not naive. It is psychological protection. The brain is designed to believe in predictability because unpredictability is emotionally exhausting. Without that belief, daily functioning would become impossible. Yet when something breaks that sense of predictability, the emotional impact is profound. For Laci's parents and sister, those early memories became frozen snapshots in their minds. The last time they heard her voice, the last shared laugh, the last small detail that suddenly carried immense weight. Psychologists often describe this as memory magnification, a process where the brain revisits ordinary moments and assigns them extraordinary importance after loss or trauma. What once felt trivial becomes sacred. Words spoken casually are replayed repeatedly, not because they held hidden meaning, but because they represent connection that can no longer be renewed. At the time, nothing felt urgent. There were no alarms, no signals of impending disaster. That is the cruel paradox of many tragedies. They are invisible until they are undeniable. The family's world was stable, structured around everyday expectations. Meals were shared. Future plans existed. Emotional bonds felt secure. This stability created a powerful sense of psychological safety, the belief that life, though imperfect, is fundamentally predictable. When safety is later disrupted, the mind does not immediately accept it. It resists, searching for explanations that restore normality. In those quiet days, the family's interactions were shaped by affection and familiarity rather than fear. There is comfort in knowing someone's habits, their voice patterns, the way they respond to messages. These details become emotional fingerprints. When those fingerprints suddenly vanish, the absence is deeply unsettling. Silence becomes suspicious. Delays become alarming. The mind begins asking questions it never needed to ask before. Yet in the beginning, those questions are soft. They do not yet carry panic. They carry confusion. It is important to understand that before tragedy, families rarely imagine catastrophe. Not because they are careless, but because imagining worst-case scenarios constantly would be psychologically unsustainable. Humans are wired to expect continuity. We plan vacations, celebrate holidays, and discuss the future precisely because we believe it will arrive. This belief is what allows emotional investment in relationships. Without it, love would feel risky and fragile. For Laci's family, Their emotional investments were built on years of shared experiences and trust in normal life's reliability. There's also a subtle emotional warmth in pre-tragedy memories. When families look back, they often recall sunlight through windows, holiday decorations, shared meals, and the gentle chaos of daily routines. These sensory memories become vivid later, not because they were extraordinary, but because they represent a world untouched by grief. In hindsight, these moments feel almost cinematic, a peaceful scene that existed right before the narrative shifted dramatically. The mind clings to them because they represent emotional innocence, a time when worry had not yet taken root. Another psychological layer present during this period is the illusion of permanence. People rarely consider that everyday interactions could be their last. This illusion is not denial. It is a survival mechanism. If individuals constantly anticipated loss, relationships would be overshadowed by fear. Instead, the mind chooses optimism. It assumes continuity because continuity feels safe. Only after disruption does the illusion become visible, revealing how much emotional security depended on it. For the family, those final calm days later became both comforting and painful. Comforting because they contained genuine happiness. Painful because they could never be revisited or recreated. Memory becomes a double-edged experience, offering warmth while simultaneously reminding them of absence. This emotional contradiction is common in families who experience sudden tragedy. Nostalgia is intertwined with grief, making even positive recollections emotionally complex. In documentary storytelling, this stage is essential because it establishes humanity before loss. Without understanding the emotional environment that existed beforehand, audiences cannot fully grasp the depth of what was taken away. The silence before the storm is not empty. It is full of life, expectations, and emotional security. That fullness is precisely why the later absence feels so heavy. Loss is measured not only by what disappears, but by what once existed. There is also a quiet vulnerability in remembering ordinary days. The family likely never imagined those simple conversations would later be analyzed, replayed, and discussed publicly. At the time, they were simply living. This contrast between private normalcy and later public scrutiny adds another layer of emotional weight. What was once intimate becomes historical. What was once casual becomes significant. The mind struggles to reconcile these shifts. Emotionally, this chapter is about stillness, the calm surface of water before a stone is thrown. It invites viewers to step into a world untouched by fear, to understand the emotional baseline from which everything later falls. The power of this moment lies in its universality. Everyone has experienced days that felt routine, unaware that change was approaching. This shared human experience creates empathy. It reminds audiences that tragedy does not only happen in distant headlines. It interrupts real lives that once looked just like their own. As the narrative moves forward, this early piece becomes a reference point. It highlights the contrast between stability and uncertainty, warmth and fear, sound and silence. The silence before the storm is not merely the absence of noise. It is the presence of trust, routine, and emotional safety. When that silence is later replaced by unanswered calls and growing worry, the emotional shift is profound precisely because of what came before. In the end, this chapter is not about foreshadowing danger. It is about honoring normal life, the small details that define relationships. It is about recognizing that before grief, there was laughter. Before uncertainty, there was confidence. Before silence, there were voices that filled rooms effortlessly. And understanding this makes everything that follows not just a story of loss, but a story of how deeply a single absence can echo through the lives of those who loved her. Before a person becomes a headline, a case file, or a subject of public discussion, they exist first and foremost as someone's child, someone's sibling, someone whose presence fills ordinary spaces with familiarity. For Laci's family, she was not defined by a single moment in time or by the tragedy that later surrounded her name. She was defined by years of shared experiences, conversations at the kitchen table, phone calls during busy days, holiday traditions, and the countless subtle interactions that quietly build emotional bonds. Understanding who she was within her family is essential because the depth of grief that follows loss is always proportional to the depth of love that existed before it. Families often develop emotional ecosystems, invisible yet powerful networks of connection that hold individuals together. Within these ecosystems, each person plays a role that extends beyond practical responsibilities. A daughter might be the one who brings laughter into tense moments. A sister might be the confidant who listens without judgment. These roles are rarely assigned formally. They evolve naturally over time. Laci's role within her family was shaped by warmth, familiarity, and emotional closeness. Her presence was not simply noticed, it was relied upon. When someone occupies such a space, their absence is not just felt. It alters the emotional structure of the entire family unit. Psychologically, attachment theory helps explain why these bonds are so powerful. Humans are wired from childhood to form emotional attachments with caregivers and siblings, and these attachments provide security, identity, and belonging. Even as adults, these early emotional connections remain deeply influential. They shape how individuals communicate, seek support, and experience comfort. For parents, a child is never merely an independent adult. There's always a lingering emotional memory of the child they once protected, guided, and celebrated. This layered perception intensifies the emotional impact of any harm that comes to them, because the mind holds multiple versions of the same person at once, the adult they became and the child they once were. Within families, memories accumulate like photographs stored in the mind. Birthdays, graduations, vacations, and simple weekends spent together create a timeline of shared life. These memories are not passive recollections. They actively reinforce emotional closeness. When families think of a loved one, they rarely see a single image. Instead, they see a mosaic of moments layered across years. For Laci's parents and sister, this mosaic represented continuity. It was evidence that life was moving forward with stability and affection. The idea that this continuity could suddenly be interrupted was not something they emotionally prepared for, because preparation for such events feels unnatural and almost impossible. Another dimension of family connection lies in routine communication. Regular phone calls, casual messages, or drop-in visits serve as emotional checkpoints. They reassure both parties that life is proceeding normally. These interactions may seem small from the outside, yet they function as emotional anchors. When these anchors are removed, families often experience a profound sense of imbalance. The absence of a simple call can carry emotional weight far beyond its practical significance. The mind begins to interpret silence as a signal rather than a coincidence, and anxiety gradually replaces comfort. Siblings, in particular, share a unique psychological relationship. Unlike parental bonds, which are rooted in care and protection, sibling bonds are often built on shared growth and mutual understanding. Sisters and brothers witness each other's transitions from childhood into adulthood. They share private jokes, disagreements, and reconciliations that outsiders rarely see. These experiences create a deep sense of familiarity that cannot be easily replicated. Losing or fearing the loss of a sibling can feel like losing a part of one's own history, because so many formative memories are intertwined. Parents, on the other hand, experience a different layer of emotional connection. For them, a child represents not only love, but also legacy and hope. They remember first steps, school achievements, and the countless small milestones that mark development. Even when children become adults, parents often retain protective instincts. This emotional layering means that any threat to a child triggers both present-day fear and echoes of past vulnerability. The mind does not separate the grown individual from the child they once were. It holds both simultaneously, intensifying emotional response. Family identity is also shaped by shared rituals. Holiday gatherings, birthday celebrations, and weekly dinners are more than social events. They are psychological reinforcements of belonging. These rituals create predictable emotional experiences that strengthen bonds. Laci's participation in such traditions would have been part of the family's sense of continuity. When someone who regularly occupies a seat at the table is suddenly absent, the ritual itself changes. The empty space becomes symbolic, reminding everyone of what once felt permanent. There's also the aspect of personality, the subtle traits that make someone irreplaceable. Humor, kindness, patience, or even quirks and habits contribute to emotional uniqueness. Families grow accustomed to these characteristics to the point where they become part of the household's atmosphere. A person's laughter might fill a room in a way no one else's can. Their perspective might balance disagreements or lighten tense conversations. These qualities are difficult to describe fully, yet they're deeply felt. When they are gone, the emotional environment shifts noticeably, even if nothing else changes physically. Another important psychological factor is the concept of emotional predictability. Families find comfort in knowing how a loved one typically responds, speaks, or behaves. This predictability reduces stress and builds trust. It creates a sense of stability that supports emotional well-being. When predictability is suddenly replaced by uncertainty, the resulting anxiety is intense because the mind has lost one of its grounding elements. The emotional comfort once provided effortlessly now becomes a source of longing. It is also essential to recognize how families construct future expectations together. Plans for upcoming events, shared goals, or simple discussions about tomorrow contribute to a collective sense of direction. These expectations are not always formal. They may be as simple as anticipating the next visit or holiday. Yet they create a psychological bridge between the present and the future. When that bridge is abruptly removed, the emotional impact extends beyond the current moment. It disrupts the sense of continuity that families depend on to feel secure. For viewers and listeners, understanding who Laci was within her family transforms the narrative from abstract tragedy into personal loss. It shifts focus from statistics to relationships. True crime often emphasizes events and outcomes, but the emotional truth lies in the connections that existed before those events unfolded. Recognizing these connections fosters empathy rather than mere curiosity. It reminds audiences that behind every case are people whose lives were intertwined in ways that cannot be summarized by headlines. This chapter is not about dramatization. It is about humanization. It is about seeing Laci as her family saw her, not as a symbol, but as a daughter and sister whose presence contributed to their emotional world. By appreciating the depth of those bonds, the audience begins to understand why the later absence felt so devastating. Loss is not measured only by what disappears physically, but by the emotional spaces that can never be filled in the same way again. In the broader psychological sense, families who experience sudden loss often find themselves revisiting these memories repeatedly. They become both sources of comfort and reminders of what has changed. This duality is complex. Remembering brings warmth, yet it also intensifies longing. Over time, these memories evolve from sharp pain into quieter reflection, but they never lose significance. They remain woven into identity, shaping how individuals see themselves and their relationships moving forward. Ultimately, this chapter serves as an emotional foundation. It establishes the depth of connection that existed before uncertainty entered the family's life. Without this understanding, later grief might seem abstract. With it, the audience can perceive the true scale of emotional impact. The story is not merely about disappearance. It is about the disruption of a network of love, trust, and shared history that once felt unbreakable. There is rarely a dramatic sound when life shifts irreversibly. No thunderclap announces it. No visible line divides before and after. Instead, change often begins quietly. A phone call that goes unanswered, a message that receives no reply, a delay that feels slightly unusual but not yet alarming. For Laci's family, the moment everything changed did not arrive as a single explosive event. It unfolded gradually, almost invisibly, until uncertainty solidified into fear. What began as mild concern slowly transformed into an emotional reality none of them were prepared to face. In the earliest hours, the mind resists panic. Human psychology is designed to preserve emotional stability whenever possible. When something feels off, the brain instinctively searches for harmless explanations. Perhaps she is busy. Perhaps her phone battery died. Perhaps she stepped out unexpectedly. These thoughts are not denial in a negative sense. They are protective mechanisms. The mind shields itself from immediate distress by exploring the least threatening possibilities first. This process allows individuals to continue functioning while uncertainty lingers in the background. However, time has a unique way of reshaping emotions. Minutes turn into hours, and the absence begins to feel heavier. The silence that once seemed explainable now feels unusual. Small details start to stand out. Missed calls, unreturned messages, routines that are suddenly broken. Families who are emotionally close tend to notice these disruptions quickly because they are accustomed to regular communication. What others might dismiss as coincidence becomes, for them, a signal that something is not right. Anxiety begins to surface, subtle at first, like a quiet hum beneath everyday activities. The psychological state during this phase is often described as cognitive dissonance, the tension between what the mind wants to believe and what reality begins to suggest. On one side lies hope and rationalization. On the other side, growing unease. People find themselves repeating reassuring thoughts while simultaneously feeling an unspoken dread. This inner conflict is emotionally exhausting. It drains focus and disturbs normal routines. Tasks that once felt automatic now require effort because part of the mind is constantly scanning for information or reassurance. For parents and siblings, the emotional intensity is amplified by familiarity. They know the person's habits, schedules, and communication patterns. When those patterns change without explanation, the emotional reaction is immediate and deeply personal. It is not merely curiosity, it is instinct. Loved ones often describe this stage as a feeling in the chest, a tightening sensation that cannot be easily dismissed. It is the body's way of responding to uncertainty before the mind fully processes it. The nervous system begins to shift into alert mode, preparing for possibilities that remain undefined. During these early moments, conversations within the family often revolve around practical questions. Have you heard from her? Did she mention any plans? These exchanges are attempts to reconstruct certainty through shared knowledge. Each family member searches their recent memories for clues, replaying conversations and scanning for overlooked details. This mental review is not only logical, it is emotional. People want reassurance that they did not miss something important, that they could have prevented or predicted the situation. The mind seeks control, even when none exists. As hours pass without resolution, emotional tone changes. Concern evolves into worry, and worry begins to edge toward fear. The body reacts physically. Sleep becomes difficult, appetite diminishes, and concentration fades. This is the onset of acute stress response, a state where the nervous system prepares for potential threat. Adrenaline levels rise, and thoughts become repetitive. Families often describe feeling restless yet frozen at the same time, unable to focus on ordinary responsibilities while also unsure what action to take. It is a limbo where every minute feels longer than the last. Another significant psychological element during this period is hope preservation. Even as fear grows, the mind clings to positive possibilities. Hope becomes both comfort and burden. It provides emotional strength, yet it also prolongs uncertainty. Loved ones may hesitate to voice worst-case scenarios, not because they ignore reality, but because speaking those fears aloud feels like giving them power. Silence becomes a form of emotional protection. Words remain carefully chosen, conversations softened, as if gentleness itself might influence outcomes. Externally, life continues as usual. Traffic moves, stores open, conversations happen in the world outside. Internally, however, everything feels altered. This contrast between normal surroundings and internal turmoil creates a surreal experience. Families often describe feeling disconnected from the world around them, as though they are watching life continue from a distance. This sensation is a mild form of dissociation, a psychological response where the mind detaches slightly to manage overwhelming emotion. It is not dramatic or obvious. It is subtle, like viewing reality through a thin layer of glass. When the realization finally begins to take shape that something is genuinely wrong, emotions intensify rapidly. Fear sharpens, and the need for action becomes urgent. Decisions that once seemed unnecessary now feel critical. Phone calls are made, questions asked, and assistance sought. Yet even in this urgency, hope remains intertwined with anxiety. The family's emotional landscape becomes a complex mix of determination and vulnerability. They are driven by love, by instinct, and by the refusal to accept uncertainty without effort. It is important to recognize that this moment is not a single point in time, but a transition. There is no exact second when concern becomes crisis. Instead, there's a gradual accumulation of unanswered questions and emotional signals that eventually reach a threshold. Crossing that threshold changes everything. Ordinary routines lose their significance. Priorities shift instantly. The mind moves from passive concern to active searching, from assumption to action. Life divides itself into two eras, before the silence and after it. Memory plays a powerful role during this stage as well. Loved ones begin recalling recent interactions with heightened intensity. Words spoken casually days earlier now feel significant. Plans discussed lightly now carry emotional weight. This process is known as retrospective meaning-making, where the brain revisits past events to find patterns or signs that were not recognized at the time. It is a natural attempt to impose order on uncertainty, to create narrative coherence where chaos threatens to dominate. Emotionally, this chapter represents the loss of innocence. It is the point where the family's perception of safety begins to fracture. They have not yet fully entered grief, but they have stepped beyond comfort. The world feels less predictable, less secure. Trust in routine, the belief that tomorrow will resemble today, begins to erode. This psychological shift is profound because it alters not only their feelings about the present, but also their expectations for the future. For audiences, understanding this moment is crucial because it highlights the human experience behind the headlines. True crime often focuses on events, evidence, and outcomes, yet the emotional turning point for families occurs long before those elements become public. It begins in private spaces, in quiet rooms, with unanswered calls and growing unease. It is deeply personal and rarely visible to outsiders, yet shapes every decision and emotion that follows. Ultimately, the moment everything changed is defined not by noise, but by silence. It is the silence of phones that do not ring, messages that do not arrive, and routines that do not repeat. It is the silence that forces the mind to confront possibilities it would rather avoid. In that silence, love transforms into urgency, and ordinary life gives way to uncertainty. The family steps into a new reality, one where every passing hour carries emotional weight, and where the search for answers becomes inseparable from the search for peace. The first 72 hours after a loved one is confirmed missing often feel less like 3 days and more like a single, endless stretch of time where morning and night lose their boundaries. For Laci's family, this period was not defined by clocks or calendars, but by emotional intensity. Minutes stretched, sleep became fragmented, and the mind refused to settle. The outside world still followed its usual rhythm. People commuting, stores opening, conversations continuing. Yet inside the family's emotional space, everything had shifted into urgency. In the beginning, action replaces reflection. There is little room for deep processing because the mind is focused on doing rather than feeling. Phone calls are made repeatedly. Contacts are checked. Questions are asked again and again, sometimes to the same people, not because answers are expected to change, but because repetition feels like progress. This is a natural psychological response known as task-oriented coping. The brain attempts to regain control by creating movement. Even small actions feel meaningful because they counter the helplessness that uncertainty creates. During these first days, adrenaline becomes a constant companion. The body produces stress hormones designed for short bursts of crisis, yet here they remain elevated for extended periods. The result is a strange mixture of energy and exhaustion. Individuals may feel wired and alert while simultaneously drained. Appetite often disappears, replaced by a dull indifference toward food. Sleep becomes shallow or inconsistent, interrupted by sudden awakenings and racing thoughts. The nervous system operates in survival mode, scanning continuously for information, signals, or updates. Communication within the family intensifies. Conversations are frequent but often fragmented, filled with partial information and emotional undercurrents. One person may speak rapidly, another quietly. Some focus on logistics, others on reassurance. These differences are not signs of conflict, but reflections of varied coping styles. Under stress, personalities reveal their adaptive strategies. Some individuals organize details meticulously. Others provide emotional comfort. Together, these responses form a collective attempt to stabilize a situation that feels inherently unstable. Hope and fear coexist in a delicate balance. Each new lead, no matter how small, carries emotional weight. A rumor, a sighting, or a suggestion can temporarily lift spirits, only for disappointment to follow when it leads nowhere. This cycle creates emotional whiplash, brief surges of optimism followed by deeper drops of discouragement. The mind struggles to regulate these fluctuations, yet it continues to pursue hope because hope is psychologically sustaining. Without it, motivation to search and engage would weaken. Even fragile optimism provides the emotional fuel necessary to continue. At the same time, the family begins to confront the reality that life will not simply return to normal overnight. This realization does not arrive fully formed. It seeps in gradually. The first missed nights, sleep might be excused. The second becomes concerning. By the third, fatigue merges with emotional strain and clarity begins to blur. The brain, deprived of rest, finds it harder to distinguish between rational assessment and emotional reaction. Thoughts loop, revisiting the same possibilities repeatedly. This mental repetition is an attempt to solve uncertainty through persistence, even when solutions remain elusive. Social circles expand quickly during this period. Friends, extended relatives, and community members step in, offering support, advice, and presence. This influx of people brings both comfort and complexity. On one hand, it reinforces that the family is not alone. On the other, it introduces additional conversations, opinions, and emotional energies. Managing these interactions requires effort at a time when emotional reserves are already depleted. The family must balance gratitude with the need for quiet focus, navigating social dynamics while carrying personal fear. Another psychological feature of these hours is hypervigilance, a heightened state of awareness where every sound, message, or notification triggers immediate attention. Phones are checked constantly. Notifications create sudden bursts of anticipation. Silence becomes heavy, while even minor updates generate disproportionate emotional reactions. This heightened sensitivity is not irrational. It is the mind's attempt to detect information that could resolve uncertainty. Yet maintaining such alertness for extended periods is exhausting, gradually wearing down emotional resilience. Memory also behaves differently during intense stress. Details from recent days are replayed repeatedly, while new information sometimes feels slippery and hard to retain. This is because the brain prioritizes emotionally charged memories, reinforcing them as significant. Family members might recall exact phrases from previous conversations, yet struggle to remember mundane details from the current day. Emotion acts as a spotlight, illuminating certain memories while leaving others in shadow. This selective recall is not intentional. It is a natural neurological response to heightened emotional states. As the 72-hour mark approaches, emotional fatigue deepens. The initial surge of energy begins to wane, replaced by a heavy weariness. Yet the need for action remains. This contrast creates a difficult psychological tension, the body asking for rest while the mind refuses to stop. Individuals may experience brief moments of emotional numbness, where feelings momentarily flatten. These moments are often misunderstood as indifference, but they are actually protective pauses. The brain momentarily reduces emotional intensity to prevent overload, allowing individuals to continue functioning. Within the family, subtle shifts in roles may begin to appear. Someone who is usually quiet might become more vocal. Another who is typically decisive may hesitate. These changes are not permanent personality alterations. They are situational adaptations. Under stress, people unconsciously adjust their behavior to meet perceived needs. One member might become the communicator with outsiders, another the organizer of information, and another the emotional anchor who offers reassurance. These evolving roles help the family operate collectively, even when individual emotions fluctuate. Despite the intensity, these early days also reveal resilience. The willingness to continue searching, asking, and hoping demonstrates the strength of emotional bonds. Love becomes action. Concern becomes determination. Even when uncertainty dominates, the family's efforts reflect deep attachment and refusal to surrender to despair. This resilience is not loud or dramatic. It is steady, expressed through persistence rather than proclamation. For observers, the first 72 hours often appear as a blur of activity. For the family, however, they are remembered as a dense emotional landscape where every interaction carried significance. The passage of time feels distorted. Hours seem longer, yet days pass quickly when measured later. This temporal distortion is a common psychological response to crisis, where heightened emotion alters the perception of duration. Moments stretch internally even as the calendar advances externally. Emotionally, this chapter represents the transition from uncertainty into sustained tension. It is the stage where concern solidifies into reality, where the mind begins to accept that the situation is not temporary. Yet acceptance here does not mean surrender, it means recognition. The family acknowledges that answers may not come easily, and that endurance will be required. This realization marks the beginning of a new emotional phase, one defined by perseverance rather than assumption. In the broader narrative, these first days are crucial because they set the emotional tone for everything that follows. They reveal the family's initial reactions, their coping mechanisms, and the strength of their connections. They also highlight the invisible psychological work that occurs behind public awareness. The sleepless nights, the repeated calls, the quiet moments of fear that never make headlines. Understanding this period allows audiences to appreciate the human dimension of crisis, not as distant observers, but as empathetic witnesses. Ultimately, the first 72 hours are less about outcomes and more about emotional endurance. They are a testament to how love responds under pressure, not by withdrawing, but by intensifying. In these hours, the family steps fully into a reality they did not choose, guided by hope, sustained by connection, and propelled by the belief that answers must exist somewhere beyond the silence. There's a significant difference between experiencing grief privately and experiencing it while being observed. In the early days, Laci's family was navigating uncertainty within the boundaries of their personal world. Phone calls, close relatives, familiar spaces. But as attention grew, the boundaries dissolved. What was once intimate became visible. What was once spoken in quiet rooms was suddenly spoken in front of cameras. The emotional landscape changed, not because the fear lessened, but because the presence of the outside world introduced a new kind of pressure, one that was psychological, social, and deeply intrusive. The arrival of media attention often begins subtly. A reporter's inquiry, a request for a statement, a camera positioned across the street. At first, it may even feel reassuring. Visibility can create the sense that more eyes mean more help, that public awareness increases the chances of answers. Yet over time, the same visibility transforms into exposure. The family is no longer simply searching or waiting. They're being watched while doing so. Their emotions, expressions, and words become subjects of interpretation. Every pause can be analyzed, every tear questioned, every sentence dissected by strangers who do not know them personally. Psychologically, this shift introduces performance pressure, the feeling that one must manage how they appear emotionally, even when overwhelmed internally. Grief becomes something that must be regulated, filtered, and sometimes postponed. A parent who wants to cry freely might instead hold back because cameras are present. A sibling who feels anger might suppress it to avoid misinterpretation. This emotional regulation requires immense energy, draining resources that would otherwise be used for coping and healing. The family is not only carrying fear and sadness, they are carrying the weight of perception. Another layer emerges through public speculation. As conversations spread, opinions form rapidly. Some are supportive, offering empathy and encouragement. Others are critical or skeptical, questioning reactions or decisions. The family becomes aware that their private pain is now subject to judgment by people who only see fragments of the situation. This awareness can create emotional isolation. Instead of feeling supported by the broader community, they may begin to feel scrutinized, misunderstood, or even unsafe in their vulnerability. The psychological term secondary victimization describes this phenomenon, when the response to a tragedy inflicts additional emotional harm. The constant presence of attention also disrupts the natural rhythm of grief. In private, emotions flow unpredictably. There are moments of tears, moments of silence, moments of distraction. Public exposure interrupts this organic process. The family may feel compelled to present strength repeatedly, offering updates or reassurances even when they themselves are uncertain. This repetition can create emotional fatigue. Words spoken once become rehearsed and repeated, gradually losing their personal meaning while retaining public significance. The emotional authenticity remains, but it is layered with exhaustion. Time itself begins to feel different under observation. Days are measured not only by personal experience, but by news cycles and public interest. Headlines rise and fall, yet the family's emotional reality remains constant. This contrast can be disorienting. The world appears to move on quickly, while the family remains emotionally anchored to the same unresolved questions. They witness attention shifting elsewhere, even as their internal turmoil continues unchanged. This disconnect between external pace and internal emotion deepens feelings of loneliness and invisibility, despite being publicly visible. Another psychological impact arises from the loss of privacy. Homes, once safe and familiar, begin to feel exposed. Ordinary actions, stepping outside, speaking on the phone, meeting a friend, may carry a sense of caution. Privacy is not merely a physical boundary, it is an emotional one. When it is eroded, individuals may struggle to find spaces where they can fully relax or express genuine feelings. This persistent awareness of being seen can increase anxiety and reduce the sense of safety that is essential for emotional recovery. Family dynamics also shift under public attention. Decisions that would normally be private become collective discussions influenced by external factors. Should they speak publicly or remain silent? Should they respond to rumors or ignore them? These questions introduce strategic thinking into an already emotional situation. The family must navigate not only their internal feelings, but also the potential consequences of every outward action. This dual awareness, personal and public, creates cognitive strain, forcing them to balance authenticity with caution. Despite these challenges, public attention is not entirely negative. Supportive messages, community gatherings, and shared empathy can provide genuine comfort. Knowing that others care can strengthen resolve and remind the family they are not alone. Yet even positive attention requires emotional energy to absorb. Gratitude coexists with fatigue. The mind must process both encouragement and criticism simultaneously, filtering what to accept and what to disregard. This emotional filtering becomes another invisible task added to an already heavy burden. Over time, the presence of cameras and conversations begins to shape memory itself. Moments once experienced privately are later recalled alongside images of microphones, flashing lights, and public statements. The emotional memory of grief intertwines with the memory of observation. Instead of remembering only the feeling, the family also remembers the setting in which it was expressed. This blending can complicate healing as private emotions become inseparable from public experiences. The boundary between personal and external narrative blurs. For the audience, it is easy to focus on the visible aspects, the interviews, the headlines, the footage. Yet the true psychological impact lies in the invisible adjustments the family makes every day. Choosing words carefully, managing expressions, deciding when to engage or withdraw. These are subtle but exhausting efforts. They reveal the emotional labor required to exist publicly while experiencing private pain. The family's strength is not only in enduring uncertainty, but also in maintaining dignity amid constant attention. Emotionally, this chapter represents the expansion of the family's world beyond their control. The crisis is no longer contained within their personal sphere. It has entered the collective consciousness. Their story becomes shared, interpreted, and sometimes distorted. They must learn to navigate not only their own emotions, but also the reactions of countless others. This expansion amplifies stress, yet also highlights resilience. Continuing to seek answers and maintain composure in such an environment requires extraordinary inner strength. In the broader narrative, this stage illustrates how tragedy transforms from a private event into a public phenomenon. It underscores the difference between empathy and curiosity, between support and scrutiny. For families, the distinction is deeply felt. Every interaction carries emotional weight, and every word spoken publicly becomes part of a larger narrative they cannot fully control. Understanding this dimension allows viewers to see beyond surface appearances and recognize the complex psychological terrain families must traverse when the world begins watching. Ultimately, the presence of public attention does not lessen grief. It changes its texture. It adds layers of awareness, responsibility, and vulnerability. The family continues to hope, search, and endure, but now they do so under a spotlight that never fully dims. Their emotional journey becomes both personal and collective, shaped not only by their own feelings, but also by the echoes of countless voices around them. In this space between privacy and publicity, they learn a difficult truth, that strength sometimes means standing still while the world looks on, carrying pain quietly even when silence is impossible. There comes a point in prolonged uncertainty when time no longer feels like a straight line. Days do not simply pass, they hover. Morning blends into afternoon, and evening arrives without the sense that anything has truly changed. For Laci's family, this period was not defined by a single event or announcement, but by an emotional state that lingered, a space where hope refused to disappear, yet fear refused to quiet. It is a psychological territory that few people understand until they are forced to inhabit it themselves. This is the space between knowing and not knowing, between preparing for the worst and refusing to accept it. Hope during this stage is not cheerful or light. It is heavy. It requires effort to maintain because every passing day challenges its existence. Yet letting go of hope feels equally unbearable. The mind creates a delicate balance, allowing optimism to exist just enough to sustain motivation while simultaneously bracing for painful possibilities. This internal tension can be exhausting. Individuals may wake each morning with a renewed sense of determination only to feel emotionally depleted by nightfall. The cycle repeats, creating emotional fatigue that settles deep into the body and mind. Psychologists often refer to this condition as ambiguous loss, a form of grief that lacks closure. Unlike definitive loss, where rituals and acceptance eventually provide emotional direction, ambiguous loss traps families in emotional limbo. There is no clear moment to mourn fully, no certainty to anchor feelings. Loved ones may hesitate to rearrange belongings or change routines because doing so feels like surrender. Yet maintaining everything exactly as it was becomes increasingly painful. The home, once a place of comfort, begins to feel suspended in time, filled with reminders that offer both warmth and sorrow. During this phase, the family's emotional landscape becomes layered. On the surface, daily responsibilities continue. Meals are prepared, errands are run, conversations occur. Beneath that surface, however, a constant undercurrent of anticipation flows. Every phone notification triggers a surge of attention. Every unexpected knock at the door carries emotional weight. This persistent alertness is a continuation of hypervigilance, but now it is less sharp and more enduring, a quiet readiness that never fully relaxes. The nervous system adapts to prolonged tension, creating a baseline of anxiety that feels almost normal despite its intensity. Relationships within the family also evolve under this sustained pressure. Members may attempt to protect one another emotionally, choosing words carefully or avoiding difficult topics to prevent additional pain. This protective instinct, though rooted in love, can sometimes create emotional distance. Silence becomes a shield, and conversations remain practical rather than deeply expressive. At other times, emotions overflow unexpectedly, leading to tears or frustration that seem disproportionate to the moment. These fluctuations are natural responses to prolonged uncertainty, reflecting the mind's struggle to maintain equilibrium. Another psychological feature of this stage is anticipatory grief, the experience of mourning possibilities that have not yet been confirmed. Families may imagine outcomes they hope never become reality, only to push those thoughts away moments later. This mental rehearsal is not pessimism. It is a subconscious attempt to prepare emotionally for any scenario. Yet the act of preparing can itself be painful. The mind moves back and forth between imagining reunion and imagining loss, unable to settle on either. This oscillation creates emotional turbulence, where relief and dread coexist within the same hour. Memory also shifts during this period. Loved ones revisit past experiences not only for comfort, but for reassurance that the person's presence is still emotionally accessible. Photographs, voice recordings, and personal items become anchors. These objects hold symbolic power, offering tangible connections in the absence of certainty. At the same time, they can intensify longing. A familiar scent or familiar handwriting can evoke powerful emotions, reminding the family of both closeness and absence simultaneously. The mind clings to these sensory cues because they provide continuity in a situation defined by disruption. Externally, the world continues to move forward. Seasons change, holidays arrive, and social events occur. For the family, However, these milestones often feel altered. Celebrations carry an undertone of incompleteness. Laughter may appear, but it is quieter, tempered by awareness of what is missing. This emotional contrast can create feelings of guilt. Guilt for moments of happiness. Guilt for brief distractions from worry. Such guilt is common in prolonged crises, arising from the mistaken belief that attention or joy might somehow diminish commitment to hope. In reality, these moments of lightness are necessary for emotional survival, even if they feel conflicted. The passage of time during ambiguous loss is paradoxical. On one hand, each day without answers deepens fear. On the other, the very act of continuing creates a form of endurance. The family learns to function while carrying uncertainty, developing resilience not through resolution, but through persistence. This resilience is quiet. It is found in waking up each morning despite emotional fatigue, in maintaining connections, in continuing to care. It does not erase pain. It coexists with it, forming a subtle strength that becomes visible only in hindsight. Social interactions also become more complex. Friends and acquaintances may offer support initially, but as time passes, their involvement often decreases. This natural shift can leave families feeling isolated, even when they understand the reasons behind it. Conversations that once centered on concern may gradually return to ordinary topics, creating a sense of emotional distance. The family may feel caught between wanting normalcy and feeling unable to fully participate in it. This tension adds another layer to the emotional landscape, blending loneliness with gratitude for those who remain present. Internally, identity begins to change. Loved ones may find that their sense of self becomes intertwined with the search for answers. Roles within the family adapt, priorities shift, and personal goals may be postponed. The emotional focus narrows, centering on uncertainty and hope. This shift is not always conscious, but it is profound. Over time, individuals may struggle to remember how life felt before this state of waiting began. The emotional experience becomes part of their personal narrative, shaping how they view time, relationships, and vulnerability. Despite the weight of this phase, there are also moments of unexpected clarity. In quiet reflections, family members may recognize the depth of their bonds and the strength of their support for one another. Shared resilience becomes a source of connection. Even without answers, they learn to communicate more gently, to appreciate small gestures, and to find comfort in presence rather than certainty. These moments do not eliminate fear, but they provide emotional balance, reminding them that connection persists even when clarity does not. For audiences, this chapter reveals the psychological endurance required in prolonged uncertainty. It shifts attention from dramatic events to sustained emotional reality. True crime narratives often focus on decisive moments. Yet for families, the most challenging experiences occur in these extended periods of waiting. Understanding this stage fosters empathy, highlighting that grief is not always loud or immediate. Sometimes it is quiet, prolonged, and deeply internal. Ultimately, living in the space between hope and fear is about learning to exist without clear answers. It is about carrying two opposing emotions simultaneously and finding a way to function despite their tension. For Laci's family, this period represented not only emotional strain, but also emotional strength. The ability to continue loving, searching, and believing even when certainty remained out of reach. In this suspended space, they discovered a difficult truth, that endurance is not the absence of pain, but the decision to keep moving forward while pain remains. There's a common belief that answers bring peace, that once uncertainty is replaced by clarity, the emotional storm settles and the mind finally rests. But for families living through prolonged disappearance, the arrival of answers is rarely simple or comforting. It is not a gentle transition from confusion to calm. Instead, it is often another emotional upheaval. one that replaces questions with realities the heart may not be ready to accept. For Laci's family, the period when information began to solidify did not feel like relief. It felt like standing at the edge of truth they had both feared and resisted for months. When details start to emerge, the mind enters a complex psychological state. Hope, which had been carefully preserved, begins to collide with evidence. The protective optimism that once sustained emotional endurance now struggles to survive. This collision creates cognitive shock, a moment when the brain attempts to reconcile emotional expectation with factual reality. Even when families sense that difficult news is coming, hearing it confirmed produces a new level of impact. Anticipation does not reduce pain, it only changes its shape. Emotionally, this stage is marked by contradiction. There may be a quiet sense of relief that uncertainty is ending, yet that relief is quickly overshadowed by grief. The absence of ambiguity removes one burden, but introduces another: permanence. The mind can no longer oscillate between possibilities. Instead, it must begin processing what has actually occurred. This shift is profound because it transforms emotional energy from searching into mourning. The transition is not immediate or smooth. It is jagged, filled with moments where acceptance feels possible and others where denial resurfaces unexpectedly. For parents and siblings, the arrival of answers often triggers a deep internal silence. Words become difficult to find. Conversations grow shorter, not from lack of emotion, but from emotional overload. The nervous system, having operated in high alert for so long, begins to experience emotional exhaustion. Tears may come suddenly or not at all. Some individuals feel numb, others overwhelmed. These responses differ from person to person, yet they share a common root. The mind is adjusting to a reality it once fought to postpone. Memory behaves differently during this phase. Earlier recollections of hope are revisited alongside the new information, creating emotional contrast. Families may think back to the days when they believed reunion was possible, experiencing both comfort and heartbreak simultaneously. This juxtaposition intensifies grief because it highlights what has been lost. Not only the person, but the future that was imagined with them. The mind mourns both presence and potential, layering sorrow upon sorrow in ways that are difficult to articulate. Another significant psychological element during this stage is identity disruption. During months of searching and waiting, family members often define themselves by their role in that process. The parent seeking answers, the sibling holding on a hope. When answers arrive, those roles dissolve abruptly. The sense of purpose that once drove daily actions changes. This shift can create feelings of emptiness or confusion, as if a central part of their identity has suddenly been removed. Grief is not only about losing someone, it is also about losing the version of oneself that existed in relation to them. Externally, the world may perceive this moment as closure. Headlines may describe resolution, and observers might assume that healing can now begin naturally. Internally, however, closure is rarely immediate. Emotional closure requires time, reflection, and personal processing. The family may feel pressure to appear relieved or composed, even when they're still absorbing the weight of reality. This disconnect between external perception and internal emotion can deepen isolation, making it harder to express genuine feelings openly. Within the family, dynamics shift once again. Conversations that once revolved around possibilities now center on remembrance and meaning. Some members may seek detailed understanding, wanting to know every fact. Others may avoid specifics, focusing instead on emotional preservation. These differences are not signs of division, but reflections of individual coping styles. Each person navigates grief through their own psychological pathway, and respecting these differences becomes essential for collective healing. There is also an element of emotional finality that emerges when answers arrive. The mind recognizes that certain questions will no longer change. This recognition can bring a strange calm alongside sorrow. a stillness that follows prolonged turbulence. Yet this calm is fragile. It coexists with waves of sadness, anger, or disbelief that surface unpredictably. Emotional processing does not follow a linear path. It moves in cycles, revisiting feelings with varying intensity over time. For many families, this stage introduces the concept of justice or accountability. While legal processes may offer structure and validation, they do not erase emotional pain. Instead, they provide a framework within which emotions unfold. The pursuit of justice becomes both a practical endeavor and a symbolic one, a way to affirm that the loss mattered, that the person's life held value beyond the tragedy. Yet even successful outcomes cannot restore what was taken. They offer acknowledgement, not replacement. Social interactions during this period often change as well. Friends and community members may express condolences or relief that uncertainty has ended. These gestures are well-intentioned, yet they can feel bittersweet. The family appreciates support, but may struggle to articulate their complex emotions. Gratitude exists alongside grief, creating layered responses that outsiders may not fully understand. The emotional vocabulary required to explain this stage is extensive, and sometimes silence feels easier than explanation. Psychologically, the arrival of answers marks the beginning of integrative grief, the gradual process of incorporating loss into one's life narrative. This integration does not mean forgetting or diminishing love. Instead, it means learning how to carry memory without being overwhelmed by it. The family begins to shift from searching outward to reflecting inward, from asking, "Where is she?" to asking, "How do we live with this?" This transition is subtle but significant. It signals the start of long-term emotional adaptation. For audiences, this chapter reveals that resolution is not synonymous with relief. True crime narratives often present answers as endpoints, but for families, they are turning points. They open the door to mourning, remembrance, and eventual healing. Yet they also introduce new emotional challenges. Understanding this distinction fosters deeper empathy, reminding viewers that closure is a process rather than a moment. Ultimately, when answers begin to arrive, the family stands at a crossroads between past and future. They carry the weight of what they now know while facing the task of redefining their lives without the presence they once relied upon. It is a stage filled with contradictions, clarity and confusion, relief and sorrow, stillness and waves of emotion. In this space, healing does not begin with forgetting. It begins with acknowledging truth, honoring memory, and finding the strength to move forward with love intact, even as the reality of loss settles into their hearts. Many people imagine the courtroom as the place where chaos finally becomes organized, where questions receive structured answers and truth is carefully examined under bright lights. From the outside, it appears methodical, almost clinical. Evidence presented, arguments made, verdicts reached. But for families who have already endured months or years of emotional strain, the courtroom is rarely a place of relief. Instead, it often becomes a space where wounds that were slowly beginning to close are reopened with precision and repetition. For Laci's family, entering this environment did not feel like stepping toward peace. It felt like stepping back into the most painful moments, now magnified and formalized. The psychological impact of legal proceedings is different from the earlier phases of uncertainty. During the search and waiting periods, emotions revolve around hope, fear, and anticipation. In the courtroom, those emotions are replaced by confrontation with detail. Facts are dissected, timelines reconstructed, and language becomes exact. This precision can be emotionally overwhelming because it strips away the protective ambiguity that once softened reality. The mind is forced to revisit events not as memories, but as structured narratives supported by evidence. This process can trigger re-traumatization, where previously processed emotions resurface with renewed intensity. One of the most difficult aspects of courtroom exposure is repetition. Painful details are not mentioned once. They're discussed again and again from multiple perspectives. Each repetition carries emotional weight. Even when the family believes they are prepared, hearing the same information spoken aloud in a formal setting can feel different. The tone of legal language, calm, neutral, procedural, contrasts sharply with the emotional significance of the content. This contrast creates a surreal experience where deeply personal loss is described in impersonal terms, intensifying feelings of disconnection. Emotionally, families often develop protective numbness during trials. This numbness is not absence of feeling. It is the mind's way of managing overload. Tears may become less frequent in public, expressions more controlled. Observers sometimes misinterpret this composure as detachment, but internally, emotions remain active and complex. The nervous system learns to contain reactions temporarily so that individuals can endure long hours of testimony and argument. After sessions end, however, those contained emotions often resurface privately, leading to exhaustion or emotional release. Another psychological challenge arises from visibility. Courtrooms are public arenas where reactions are observed not only by legal participants, but also by media and spectators. Families may feel they must regulate their expressions, aware that a single moment of visible anger or grief could be interpreted or broadcast. This awareness introduces performance pressure once again, similar to earlier media exposure, but intensified by the gravity of the setting. The emotional labor required to maintain composure adds another invisible layer to their burden. Listening to opposing arguments can also be deeply unsettling. Legal defense strategies often involve questioning interpretations, presenting alternative narratives, or emphasizing uncertainty. While these tactics are part of due process, they can feel personal to families who view the situation through emotional truth rather than legal strategy. Hearing familiar events reframed in unexpected ways may provoke frustration or disbelief. This experience can create cognitive dissonance, where the family's lived reality clashes with the procedural language of the court. Time inside the courtroom behaves differently as well. Sessions may stretch for hours, yet emotional focus makes them feel compressed or distorted. Attention is intense, directed toward every word and gesture. Outside, days continue normally. Inside, time feels suspended. This temporal distortion is a common stress response, reflecting the mind's concentration on emotionally significant information. After leaving the courtroom, families often feel drained, as if they have lived through an entire day's worth of emotion in a single sitting. Family dynamics also evolve during this stage. Members may take turns attending sessions or supporting one another, recognizing that emotional endurance has limits. Some find strength in shared presence, while others need moments of distance to process privately. These differing needs are natural. What matters most is mutual understanding. The recognition that coping styles vary and that support can take many forms, from quiet companionship to simple logistical help. The courtroom becomes not only a legal arena, but also a testing ground for collective resilience. Despite the strain, there can also be moments of validation. Hearing official acknowledgement of facts or seeing structured attention given to the case can affirm that the loss is recognized beyond the family's private world. This validation does not erase pain, but it can provide a sense of legitimacy and visibility. The family's experience is no longer confined to personal memory. It is recorded, examined, and acknowledged within a formal system. Such moments can offer brief, emotional steadiness amid the turbulence. However, the conclusion of each session rarely brings immediate relief. Instead, families often leave carrying renewed emotional weight. Conversations afterward may be quiet, reflective, or punctuated by sudden emotion. Sleep can be disrupted as the mind replays testimonies or visual details. The nervous system, once again elevated by the day's intensity, takes time to settle. This cycle repeats with each appearance, creating cumulative fatigue that extends beyond the courtroom walls. For observers, Trials may appear as decisive chapters, steps toward closure. For families, they are chapters of endurance. Closure is not delivered by a single verdict or statement. It emerges gradually, if at all. The courtroom provides structure and resolution in a legal sense, but emotional resolution remains a personal journey. Understanding this distinction is essential. Legal outcomes address accountability and procedure, while emotional healing unfolds on its own timeline, often long after proceedings end. Ultimately, the courtroom represents a paradox. It is a place designed to clarify truth, yet for families it often intensifies emotional complexity. It demands presence while testing endurance, offers validation while reopening pain. Within its formal boundaries, love and memory encounter legal language and structured debate. For Laci's family, walking into that space required strength, not because it promised immediate peace, but because it required them to revisit their deepest wounds with composure and dignity. In a broader narrative, this stage highlights the difference between public resolution and private healing. It reminds audiences that justice processes are not merely intellectual or procedural. They're profoundly human experiences. Behind every piece of evidence sits a family absorbing its emotional implications. And while the courtroom may eventually close its doors, the emotional journey it intensifies continues quietly afterward, shaped by memory, resilience, and the enduring effort to carry truth without being defined entirely by pain. Long before social media became as powerful as it is today, public opinion already carried immense influence. Conversations happened in living rooms, on television panels, in newspapers, and across communities. For families experiencing tragedy, these external voices can feel like an invisible crowd constantly standing just outside the door, close enough to be heard, impossible to fully answer. For Laci's family, this stage introduced a new emotional challenge. Not only living with grief and uncertainty, but also living with the awareness that countless strangers were forming conclusions about their lives, their reactions, and their pain. Public opinion has a unique psychological weight because it is both everywhere and nowhere at the same time. A single comment or headline might seem small, yet when multiplied across thousands of voices, it creates a persistent background noise. Families become aware that their story is no longer theirs alone. It belongs to public discourse, to debates, to speculation. This awareness can create a sense of emotional exposure, the feeling that personal grief has become a shared object of discussion rather than a private experience. The loss of narrative control is deeply unsettling, as it removes the ability to shape how events are understood. One of the most challenging aspects of public judgment is interpretation. People observing from a distance often focus on visible reactions, facial expressions, tone of voice, posture during interviews or court appearances. These outward behaviors are then analyzed as if they reveal internal truth. For families, this can be profoundly frustrating. Grief does not follow a universal script. Some cry openly, others remain composed. Some speak frequently, others withdraw. None of these responses are wrong. Yet public perception sometimes treats them as indicators of authenticity or suspicion. This scrutiny creates pressure to perform grief correctly, even though no such standard exists. Psychologically, this stage introduces social identity stress, the strain that arises when personal identity becomes linked to public narrative. The family is no longer seen solely as individuals with private lives. They are associated with the case itself. Strangers may recognize their names, faces, or roles without knowing their personalities or histories. This reduction of identity can feel dehumanizing, as complex lives are condensed into a single context. The emotional toll lies not only in what is said, but in how it reshapes self-perception. The family may begin to see themselves through the lens of public opinion, questioning how they are viewed rather than focusing solely on their own healing. Another layer of difficulty comes from the permanence of public commentary. Unlike private conversations that fade with time, public narratives tend to linger. Articles remain accessible, discussions are archived, and opinions can resurface years later. This persistence creates a feeling that the past is never fully past. Even as the family attempts to move forward, reminders can reappear unexpectedly, reopening emotional wounds. The sense of being continually revisited by the same narrative can hinder the natural progression of grief, making it harder to establish emotional distance. Supportive voices do exist, and they can provide genuine comfort. Messages of empathy, community gatherings, and gestures of solidarity remind families that compassion is present alongside judgment. However, absorbing both support and criticism simultaneously requires emotional filtering. The mind must decide which voices to internalize and which to release. This filtering process is not easy. Negative comments often carry disproportionate emotional weight because they challenge dignity or question sincerity. Even when surrounded by encouragement, a single harsh opinion can linger, echoing louder than dozens of kind ones. Family dynamics also shift under the influence of public perception. Members may become more cautious about speaking publicly, aware that their words can be interpreted beyond their intention. Conversations within the household may include discussions about what to say or what to avoid, blending emotional expression with strategic consideration. This blending adds cognitive strain as natural communication becomes intertwined with awareness of external reaction. The home, once a refuge from outside judgment, now carries the shadow of public awareness. There is also the psychological phenomenon of vicarious confrontation, where families feel emotionally confronted by opinions they never directly asked for. Reading or hearing speculation can feel intrusive, as though strangers are entering private emotional territory uninvited. This intrusion can lead to withdrawal, where individuals limit exposure to media or public spaces to protect their mental well-being. While withdrawal can offer temporary relief, it may also create isolation, reducing opportunities for positive connection. Balancing protection with openness becomes an ongoing challenge. Time does not necessarily soften the impact of public opinion. It changes its form. Early on, discussions may focus on immediate events. Later, they may shift to retrospectives or documentaries. Each resurgence brings renewed attention, reminding the family that their story continues to live in public memory. This persistence can feel like carrying an emotional echo, a reminder that while personal healing moves forward, public narrative often circles back. The family must learn to coexist with this echo, acknowledging its presence without allowing it to dominate their identity. Emotionally, this chapter represents the struggle to maintain self-definition amid external interpretation. It is about reclaiming personal narrative, deciding which voices matter, and recognizing that public perception, while influential, does not determine truth or worth. Families who navigate this stage successfully often develop a strong internal compass, relying on close relationships and personal values rather than fluctuating external opinions. This internal grounding becomes a form of psychological resilience, allowing them to move forward without being entirely shaped by outside judgment. For audiences, understanding this phase highlights the ethical dimension of true crime consumption. Behind every discussion or comment lies a real family experiencing real emotions. Curiosity is natural, but empathy requires awareness of impact. Recognizing the weight of public voices encourages more thoughtful engagement, transforming passive observation into conscious understanding. It reminds viewers that stories do not exist in isolation. They intersect with living people whose emotional journeys continue long after headlines fade. Ultimately, the weight of public opinion is not measured solely by its volume, but by its persistence. For Laci's family, navigating this landscape required strength, not only to endure personal grief, but also to maintain dignity amid constant commentary. Their experience illustrates a difficult truth: that tragedy does not end when events conclude. It continues through the narratives others create. Learning to carry one's own truth while surrounded by countless interpretations becomes an act of quiet courage, a commitment to self-definition in a world that often speaks too loudly to listen. When the headlines begin to fade and the cameras slowly disappear, many assume that healing naturally follows. There's a quiet expectation that once public attention moves elsewhere, families can finally return to normal life. But grief does not follow the pace of news cycles. It does not end because the world grows quieter. For Laci's family, the most enduring phase was not the search, the trial, or the public scrutiny. It was the long stretch of years that followed, where absence settled into everyday life like a shadow that never fully lifts. Long-term grief is different from the initial shock of loss. In the beginning, emotions are intense and immediate. Over time, they become woven into routine. The pain may not always be sharp, but it is present in subtler forms. A quiet ache during ordinary moments, a sudden wave of sadness triggered by a song, a familiar scent, or a date on the calendar. Psychologists often describe this as persistent grief, where emotional impact continues beyond what society typically expects. It is not a sign of weakness or inability to move forward. It is evidence of deep emotional connection that does not simply dissolve with time. Daily life gradually resumes its structure. Work continues, responsibilities return, and social interactions resume. Yet within this apparent normalcy lies a constant awareness of what is missing. An empty chair at a family gathering, an unused phone number, or a birthday that arrives without celebration becomes a quiet reminder. These reminders do not always provoke tears. Sometimes they produce silence, a pause that only the family fully understands. Grief in this stage is less visible but deeply rooted, shaping emotional responses in ways that outsiders rarely notice. Sleep patterns often change during prolonged grief. Nights may bring reflection or restless thoughts, while mornings can carry a heaviness that takes time to lift. The body remembers stress even when the mind attempts to focus elsewhere. Emotional fatigue can appear unexpectedly, making simple tasks feel more demanding. This is the nervous system's lingering response to sustained emotional strain. Recovery is not linear. It moves forward, stalls, and moves again, reflecting the natural rhythm of human resilience. Anniversaries hold particular significance. Dates connected to loss can act as emotional landmarks, drawing attention inward regardless of external circumstances. Even when families try to treat these days like any other, memory has a way of resurfacing. The mind recalls details vividly, conversations, surroundings, feelings, as if time briefly folds back on itself. These anniversaries are not merely reminders of tragedy. They are reminders of love, connection, and the life that once filled those days. The emotional weight they carry is complex, blending sorrow with remembrance. Social relationships also evolve under the long shadow of grief. Friends may initially provide strong support, but over time their involvement often decreases as they assume healing has progressed. This natural shift can leave families feeling quietly isolated. Conversations that once revolve around shared concern return to everyday topics, while the family's internal experience remains deeply tied to memory. Balancing participation in ordinary life with the private continuation of grief requires emotional flexibility and patience, both with oneself and with others. Another dimension of prolonged grief is identity adjustment. Families do not simply mourn a person. They adapt to a world where roles and expectations have changed. A parent may feel the absence of future milestones that will never occur. A sibling may sense the loss of shared experiences that once felt guaranteed. These adjustments reshape self-perception. Individuals begin to define themselves not only by who they are, but by what they carry emotionally. Over time, this integration becomes less painful, yet it remains a part of personal narrative. Memory itself transforms during this period. Early recollections may be dominated by the circumstances of loss, but gradually, earlier memories resurface. Laughter, shared trips, small habits that once felt ordinary. This shift represents memory rebalancing, where the mind begins to honor the fullness of a person's life rather than focusing solely on the ending. It is an important psychological step, allowing remembrance to coexist with healing rather than obstruct it. Love becomes less tied to pain and more connected to appreciation. Despite the heaviness, resilience often emerges quietly. Families learn coping strategies, whether through therapy, support groups, or personal reflection. They discover that continuing to live fully does not diminish the importance of memory. Instead, it honors it. Small victories, enjoying a day without overwhelming sadness, engaging in new experiences, finding moments of laughter, become meaningful milestones. These moments do not signal the absence of grief. They signal the coexistence of grief and growth. Community perception also changes with time. Public narratives fade, leaving families with a more private emotional environment. This reduction of attention can bring relief, yet it can also feel like the world has forgotten something deeply significant. The family learns to hold remembrance internally rather than relying on external acknowledgement. This shift strengthens internal bonds, reinforcing the importance of shared memory and mutual understanding within the household. Emotionally, the long shadow of grief is not a single feeling, but a spectrum. Some days feel steady and manageable, others unexpectedly heavy. The unpredictability can be frustrating, yet it is also human. Emotions do not obey schedules. They respond to associations, environments, and internal states. Accepting this variability becomes part of the healing process, allowing individuals to experience emotions without self-judgment. Patience with oneself becomes as important as support from others. For observers, this chapter reveals that tragedy does not conclude with formal endings. Legal resolutions and public statements mark transitions, not conclusions. The true emotional journey continues privately, shaped by daily experiences and personal reflection. Understanding this helps audiences move beyond the idea of closure as a single moment and toward the recognition of healing as an ongoing process. It encourages empathy that extends beyond the immediate aftermath into the quieter years that follow. Ultimately, the long shadow of grief is not solely defined by sorrow. It is also defined by endurance, adaptation, and the quiet persistence of love. Families learn that moving forward does not mean leaving the past behind. It means carrying it differently. Memory becomes less a wound and more a thread woven into identity. The absence remains, but it no longer defines every moment. Instead, it becomes part of a larger emotional landscape, one that includes sadness, resilience, and the gradual return of light alongside shadow. After years of carrying grief, something subtle often begins to change. The pain does not vanish, and the memories do not fade, but the way they are held begins to shift. For many families who endure prolonged tragedy, there comes a period where survival slowly turns into reflection. The focus moves from how do we endure this to how do we live with this? This transition is not dramatic. It does not arrive with a clear announcement. Instead, it emerges quietly through small realizations, moments when breathing feels easier, when memories bring warmth alongside sadness, when life begins to feel possible again without guilt. For Laci's family, this stage represented a different kind of emotional work. Earlier phases demanded action, endurance, and confrontation. Now the challenge became internal, learning how to exist in a world permanently altered while still allowing joy, connection, and purpose to return. This process is often described by psychologists as meaning-making, the human tendency to search for significance after profound loss. It is not about justifying tragedy or finding comfort in pain. It is about constructing a narrative that allows the heart to carry memory without being crushed by it. Meaning-making often begins with questions. Why did this happen? What can be learned? How can something so painful coexist with a future that still holds possibility? These questions rarely receive definitive answers, yet asking them is itself therapeutic. They guide individuals toward reflection rather than paralysis. Families may begin to recognize that while they cannot change the past, they can shape how it influences their future. This realization marks the beginning of post-traumatic growth, a psychological phenomenon where adversity leads to increased empathy, resilience, or purpose. Purpose does not always manifest in large gestures. Sometimes it appears in small acts, supporting another family facing loss, participating in community awareness events, or simply sharing experiences to help others feel less alone. These actions transform grief from a purely internal burden into a source of connection. The pain remains personal, yet it gains a dimension of contribution. Instead of asking only why us, families begin to ask, how can this help someone else? This shift does not erase sorrow. It reframes it, allowing emotional energy to move outward rather than remaining trapped inside. Another aspect of this stage is the reintroduction of joy without guilt. In earlier phases, moments of happiness can feel conflicting, as though smiling dishonors memory. Over time, families learn that joy does not replace love, it coexists with it. Laughter becomes less rare. Celebrations regain their color. These experiences are not betrayals of the past, but affirmations of life continuing. The heart gradually learns that carrying memory and embracing happiness are not mutually exclusive. This understanding is one of the most profound emotional transitions in long-term healing. Relationships often deepen during this period. Shared adversity can strengthen bonds, creating a level of understanding that did not exist before. Conversations become more authentic, empathy more immediate. Family members may express appreciation more openly, recognizing the fragility of time. The loss that once threatened to divide them now becomes a thread of unity. This closeness is not built on shared pain alone, but on shared endurance. The recognition that they walked through darkness together and emerged still connected. Internally, identity evolves once more. Earlier, identity may have been shaped by roles in the search or by public narratives. Now, identity becomes more self-defined. Individuals begin to see themselves not only as survivors of tragedy, but as people with aspirations, talents, and relationships that extend beyond it. This expansion of identity is crucial. It allows life to feel multidimensional again, reducing the emotional dominance of a single event. Memory becomes a chapter rather than the entire book. Memory itself also transforms in tone. Instead of being dominated by loss, recollections begin to highlight personality, humor, and shared experiences. Photographs evoke stories rather than only sorrow. Voice recordings or letters become sources of comfort rather than triggers of pain. This shift is not forgetfulness. It is emotional integration. The mind learns to hold remembrance in a way that honors life rather than solely focusing on absence. Love becomes the central theme, with loss acknowledged but no longer overpowering. Social interactions often regain ease during this stage. Families may find themselves more willing to engage in community events or discussions that once felt overwhelming. Conversations broaden beyond tragedy, allowing new interests and connections to develop. This does not mean the past is ignored. It means it is no longer the sole lens through which life is viewed. The emotional bandwidth that was once consumed by grief begins to accommodate curiosity, creativity, and hope. There's also a renewed sense of agency. Earlier phases were dominated by waiting, reacting, and enduring. Now, choices feel more intentional. Families may set new goals, pursue long-postponed dreams, or establish traditions that honor memory while celebrating the present. This agency represents a return of personal power, the realization that while tragedy shaped part of their journey, it does not dictate its entirety. The future regains its openness, even if it looks different from what was once imagined. For audiences, this chapter reveals a crucial truth. Healing is not about erasing pain, but about transforming its role. True resilience does not come from pretending loss never happened. It comes from integrating it into a broader emotional landscape. Witnessing families move from survival to purpose challenges the common misconception that grief only diminishes. In reality, grief evolves. It becomes quieter, more reflective, and sometimes even instructive, teaching empathy and appreciation that might otherwise remain dormant. Ultimately, searching for meaning is an act of courage. It requires looking at the past without being consumed by it, and looking at the future without fear of forgetting. For Laci's family, finding strength did not mean becoming untouched by sorrow. It meant learning how to carry memory with dignity while allowing life to continue unfolding. Their journey illustrates that even after profound loss, the human capacity for growth remains intact. In the delicate balance between remembrance and renewal, they discovered a truth that resonates universally. That love, when held with intention and compassion, can become a source of strength rather than solely a reminder of pain. When people look back on a crime, they often remember the names that dominated headlines, the legal battles, the dramatic turning points. What fades more easily from public memory are the people who continued living quietly in the aftermath. The parents, the siblings, the loved ones whose lives were permanently altered but rarely revisited. They become what many psychologists call the invisible victims, not because their pain is unseen by those close to them, but because the broader world gradually shifts its attention elsewhere. For Laci's family, this final chapter is not about events. It is about the long echo that follows them through the years, shaping their lives in ways both subtle and profound. The idea of invisibility does not mean absence of support or empathy. It refers to the way society tends to conclude stories once formal resolutions occur. Verdicts are delivered, documentaries end, and conversations slow. Yet for families, the emotional narrative continues indefinitely. Each day carries small reminders, a familiar song, a passing resemblance, a memory triggered unexpectedly. These moments do not dominate life, but they weave quietly through it, forming a continuous thread that never fully disappears. The family learns to coexist with this thread, allowing it to remain without letting it define every breath. Legacy becomes an important concept during this phase. Legacy is not limited to achievements or public recognition. It also lives in memory, in influence, in the subtle ways a person continues to shape those who love them. For Laci's family, her legacy exists in stories retold at gatherings, in shared humor remembered years later, in values passed down through generations. Legacy transforms absence into presence of a different kind. Instead of asking only what was lost, families begin to recognize what remains, the imprint left on their character, their compassion, and their understanding of life's fragility. Emotionally, this stage is characterized by integration rather than resolution. Integration means that grief no longer stands apart from life. It becomes part of it. It is present, acknowledged, but not overwhelming. Families learn to hold memory alongside daily responsibilities, ambitions, and relationships. This coexistence does not diminish love. On the contrary, it allows love to persist in healthier ways. The memory of a loved one becomes a quiet companion rather than a constant source of pain. It sits gently in the background, emerging in moments of reflection rather than dominating every thought. The concept of invisible victims also highlights a broader societal lesson. Crimes do not end with court decisions. Their impact radiates outward, affecting communities and relationships in ways that statistics cannot capture. Recognizing this encourages deeper empathy. It shifts focus from curiosity about events to compassion for people. When viewers or listeners understand that families continue carrying emotional weight long after attention fades, it changes how stories are perceived. They become less about sensational details and more about human endurance. Another dimension of this chapter is the quiet transformation of perspective. Families who endure profound loss often develop a heightened awareness of time and connection. Ordinary moments gain significance. Conversations become more intentional. Gratitude appears more frequently, not as forced optimism, but as genuine recognition of life's unpredictability. This perspective does not eliminate sorrow, but it introduces balance. It allows appreciation and remembrance to coexist, creating a richer emotional landscape than either could alone. Community memory also plays a role in shaping legacy. While public attention may diminish, local or personal remembrance continues. Friends recall shared experiences, extended relatives pass down stories, and small acts of tribute keep memory alive. These gestures do not need grandeur to hold meaning. A simple annual gathering, a shared photograph, or a recurring story told to younger generations can sustain presence across decades. Through these acts, the individual's influence remains active rather than static. Internally, families often reach a point where grief feels less like an open wound and more like a scar. The scar does not vanish. It becomes part of the body's history. It may ache occasionally, especially when touched by memory, but it also represents healing. This metaphor captures the emotional state of long-term integration, the understanding that pain has changed form. It no longer demands constant attention, yet remains acknowledged. This balance is not achieved quickly. It is the result of years of adaptation, reflection, and resilience. For audiences, the final chapter invites a shift in focus. Instead of asking only how a tragedy unfolded, it encourages reflection on what remains afterward. It challenges the tendency to view stories as complete once outcomes are known. In reality, the most meaningful chapters often occur quietly, outside public view. These chapters reveal the strength required not just to survive crisis, but to build a life that honors memory without being imprisoned by it. They show that healing is not a destination, but an ongoing relationship with the past. Ultimately, the quiet legacy left behind is not solely defined by loss. It is defined by the continuation of love, by the choices families make to live with intention, and by the compassion they extend to others who face similar pain. Laci's family, like many others who endure tragedy, carries forward a story that is both personal and universal. It speaks to the enduring human capacity to adapt, to remember, and to find meaning even when certainty is gone. In the end, the invisible victims are not truly invisible. They are present in every lesson learned, every act of empathy inspired, and every life touched by the memory they carry. Their journey reminds us that behind every public story lies a private continuum of emotion, one that does not end with headlines or verdicts. It continues quietly, shaped by love, resilience, and a decision to move forward while still honoring what came before. And in that quiet continuation, a different kind of justice emerges. Not legal or public, but deeply human. The justice of remembrance, dignity, and enduring connection. When a story reaches its apparent ending, viewers often expect silence, a fade to black, a final sentence, closure. Yet the truth is that real lives do not end when documentaries do. They continue quietly, evolving in ways that rarely make headlines. The emotional journeys of families who experience tragedy are not confined to timelines or chapters. They stretch across decades, shaping how individuals view trust, safety, love, and even the passage of time itself. This extended reflection is not about revisiting pain, but about understanding the broader human lessons that emerge from it. One of the most powerful lessons is the fragility of ordinary moments. Before loss, routines feel permanent. After loss, they are recognized as privileges. Simple interactions, a casual phone call, a shared meal, a brief message take on new significance. Families who endure sudden tragedy often become deeply aware that these everyday exchanges are the true foundations of connection. This awareness does not arise from fear alone. It arises from recognition. Life's most meaningful elements are often the ones overlooked when everything feels secure. Another lesson lies in empathy. Observing the emotional endurance of families left behind challenges viewers to reconsider how they engage with true crime narratives. It encourages a shift from passive consumption to compassionate awareness. Behind every case number or documentary title is a network of relationships permanently altered. Recognizing this changes the tone of conversation. It transforms curiosity into respect and discussion into understanding. Empathy becomes not an abstract ideal, but a practical response. The willingness to see stories through the lens of humanity rather than spectacle. There is also the psychological insight that grief does not follow a universal schedule. Society often expects healing to progress in visible stages, yet emotional recovery is rarely linear. Some days feel lighter, others unexpectedly heavy. Families learn to accept this variability rather than fight it. This acceptance becomes a quiet form of strength. It allows them to move forward without denying the presence of memory. For viewers, this insight offers a broader understanding of human resilience. The idea that endurance is not the absence of emotion, but the capacity to experience it without being overwhelmed. Another enduring theme is the redefinition of identity. Families who endure public tragedy often spend years being associated with a single event. Over time, reclaiming personal identity becomes an act of empowerment. They are not only survivors of loss. They are parents, siblings, professionals, and individuals with aspirations beyond the narrative that once defined them. This redefinition is gradual and deeply personal. It reflects the universal human need to be seen in full rather than reduced to a single chapter of life. For audiences, this extended reflection serves a different purpose than earlier chapters. It is not about recounting events or analyzing psychology alone. It is about integration, taking what has been learned and allowing it to influence perspective. Viewers are invited to reflect on their own relationships, their own routines, and the ways they express care. The story becomes a mirror rather than a distant account. It asks quiet questions without demanding answers. Who do we call when we think of them? What moments do we take for granted? How do we show appreciation while time is still available? There is also a broader cultural lesson embedded in these narratives. True crime often focuses on perpetrators, investigations, and legal outcomes. Shifting attention toward families introduces balance. It reminds society that justice systems address accountability, but emotional healing unfolds within communities and households. Both dimensions are important, yet the latter often receives less attention. Highlighting family impact broadens understanding, encouraging a more holistic view of tragedy and its consequences. Emotionally, this final segment is meant to leave viewers not with despair, but with awareness. The goal is not to amplify sorrow, but to illuminate resilience and empathy. Families who endure profound loss demonstrate a capacity for adaptation that is deeply human. They continue celebrating birthdays, pursuing goals, and forming new memories while carrying the past with them. This coexistence of remembrance and renewal reveals a truth that resonates universally. That love does not end with absence. It changes form. In closing, the lessons drawn from families left behind are not confined to one story or one case. They echo across cultures and time periods. They remind us that behind every headline lies a continuum of human experience, relationships, routines, and emotional bonds that persist long after public attention fades. When viewers carry these lessons forward, the documentary transcends entertainment. It becomes a reflection on connection, compassion, and the quiet strength required to live fully even after life has been irrevocably altered. And perhaps that is the most meaningful ending a story like this can offer. Not closure in the traditional sense, but awareness. An awareness that encourages kindness in everyday interactions, patience with unseen struggles, and appreciation for the ordinary moments that quietly define our lives. In the end, stories like this do not conclude with a verdict, a headline, or even a final chapter. They continue quietly in the lives of those who remain. Behind every case discussed, every timeline analyzed, and every theory debated, there are families who wake up each day carrying memories that never truly fade. Their strength is not measured by how quickly they heal, but by how they learn to live while holding both love and loss in the same heart. What we have explored is not only a story about disappearance or investigation. It is a story about the emotional aftermath that rarely receives the same attention. It is about parents who continue forward with invisible weight, siblings who carry shared memories like photographs in the mind, and communities that slowly learn how to speak of someone in the past tense while still feeling their presence in the present. These are the quiet echoes of tragedy, the parts that do not make headlines but shape real lives for years. And perhaps that is the most important takeaway. True crime is not only about understanding what happened. It is also about understanding what remains. When we shift our focus from events to people, from curiosity to empathy, the narrative changes. We begin to see that every case is not just a mystery solved or unsolved, but a network of human connections permanently altered. Compassion becomes the lens, and awareness becomes the lasting impact. For viewers, the value of stories like this lies in reflection. It invites us to appreciate the ordinary conversations we often postpone, the small gestures we assume we can repeat tomorrow, the people we believe will always be there. Life's most meaningful moments are rarely dramatic. They're simple, quiet, and easily overlooked. Recognizing their importance while they are still within reach is perhaps the greatest lesson these stories offer. As this documentary closes, the intention is not to leave you with sadness, but with awareness. Awareness of the unseen journeys people carry. Awareness of how deeply relationships shape us. An awareness that empathy has the power to transform how we engage with stories of loss. When we listen with understanding rather than judgment, we honor not only the individuals at the center of the story, but also the families who continue living beyond it. Because in the end, what remains is not only the memory of what was taken, it is the memory of love that continues quietly, persistently, and profoundly. And sometimes, the most meaningful tribute we can offer is not another theory or another discussion, but a moment of compassion for the lives that move forward long after the cameras stop rolling. If you found this documentary meaningful, please consider subscribing to the channel. A simple like helps this video reach more people who value thoughtful storytelling. And your comments keep the conversation respectful and alive. And if you'd like to support deeper research and exclusive content, you can also join the channel membership. Your support truly helps this work continue.